Hi everyone, an extremely colourful and elaborate jacket here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of low-key flexing on Pharaoh with your biblical-era Gucci drip. And today we're going to be doing a review of the new Neal Morse album, The Restoration, Joseph, Part 2. Finally, the new release schedule 2024 has begun in earnest, and who better to open the floodgates than one of the most singularly prolific artists in modern progressive rock, Neal Morse. Coming in hot off the heels of The Dreamer, Joseph Part 1, we're now less than 6 months since that album, and The Restoration, Joseph Part 2 is already with us. I mean, I'm under little to no doubt that the two albums were either written together, or recorded together, or whatever. Or perhaps Neal is really just that energised when it comes to making music that he can throw together a new record in a little over half a year since the last one. What's most impressive about Morse's output is that despite how much stuff he puts out there, there is always a sense of enthusiasm and energy to virtually everything he does. I have yet to encounter a Neal Morse album or project that feels half-baked or lacking in the usual love and attention that I've come to expect from it. I mean, yes, some albums are a little weak to me musically. I've never been a huge fan of his bare-bones singer-songwriter stuff like Songs from November and Life and Times, but when you consider that these are often paired up with the more grandiose prog rock offerings like Innocence and Danger and The Similitude of a Dream, then I think we can allow Grandpa Morse the occasional acoustic number. But here we are, part 2 in his latest ambitious biblical adventure. Call this his Andrew Lloyd Webber moment, if you will, as we continue to explore the life of the titular Joseph, whom you might remember from popular books such as the Bible and, well, just the Bible, really, as we have another exciting entry into the Neal Morse progressive musical theatre rock album universe. Now, this is most assuredly a part 2, and to get the absolute best out of this album, you will need a considerable familiarity and appreciation for part 1. There's a smattering of leitmotifs, especially in the latter half of the record, that simply won't hit as hard without a knowledge of the album that preceded this. Now, that is not to say that The Restoration is without its individualistic charms. There's still a lot of moments in isolation that still work incredibly well here. I Hate My Brothers, All Hail, Dreamer in the Jailhouse, and Make Like a Breeze all stand up incredibly well, and for my money are some of the best tracks across the scope of the whole Joseph project. I Hate My Brothers is especially toothsome, having the exact kind of infectious toe-tapping grooves I've come to expect from Morse when he channels his inner showman. Now, my biggest complaint with Part 2 over Part 1 is I feel this does take maybe a little while to wind up to its A-game when compared to each other. I felt like Part 1 had a reliable slew of bangers right from the starting gun, but for me it's not until about halfway through 4th track All Hail that the show really gets going for me. This is especially disappointing as it's only in these opening few tracks that we get the delightful lead guest vocals from Ross Jennings, a new addition to the project, and no doubt being made use of due to his recent collaboration with Neal under the DMJ project and their second album from last year, Sophomore. Now, I love Ross Jennings as much as the next guy, and while I enjoy his input on The Restoration a great deal, I do feel like it was almost a bit of a last-minute decision to include him, and that he's somewhat underutilised here. The same cannot be said of the other guest vocalists though. Eric Gillette, Ted Leonard and Matt Smith amongst others are back again, and they all managed to make their presence suitably felt. I'm a huge fan of Ted and Neal singing together on the same tracks, and I particularly appreciate seeing both past and present of Spock's beard living together in perfect harmony, giving me endless unspoiled hope that we will one day see Neal singing on the next Beard album, even if only in a limited capacity. A man can dream, and I will be holding on to that dream for as long as I possibly can. One thing that I found quite interesting in the wake of the release of The Dreamer last year was just how many people didn't really gel with it, criticising it as being too musical theatre and not proggy enough, which honestly I found a little confusing. As to compare either of these albums to actual musical theatre, it's quite clear that the similarities are only really skin deep. But I digress. Yes, there is an element of the stage show about this album, just like there was on The Dreamer. But in its heart, this is still progressive rock. There is plenty of syncopated grooves, unusual instrumentation, and odd time signatures dance on a volcano across the breadth of its extended 75-minute long runtime, and everything feels extremely classic Neal Morse. But if you didn't enjoy The Dreamer, then the restoration will most assuredly not convert you. I personally rather liked Part 1, so it's of little surprise that I've thoroughly enjoyed Part 2 as well. For me, this feels like the most natural evolution of the sounds explored on the first album, but with a little bit of extra thrown in. The a cappella focused tracks are of a particular delight, and in a lot of ways give me a similar energy to the suit fugue Dance of the A&R Men from Kevin Gilbert's masterpiece record The Shaming of the True. There's not a great deal of music on here that sticks around for any longer than it needs to. The longest tracks don't even hit the 8-minute mark. But honestly, I think the album benefits greatly from this structuring. And perhaps this is where people's accusations of musical theatre are coming from. We as a fan base are often far more used to Neal firing out 20-minute epics and beyond. And perhaps that would have been nice here, I don't know, but I honestly don't think it's needed. The shorter song structures, the slew of ideas and energetic nature of the music wouldn't really suit the slow burn, drawn-out nature of that kind of epic. The album isn't without a few slower moments though, and I do feel that as a standalone record this is slightly better paced than its predecessor, and as much as I personally adore the callbacks scattered throughout the album, Guilty as Charged is a brilliant example of this, I can imagine a lot of the more vocal critics of the first record will be using this as ammunition to evidence that Neal is running out of ideas. The restoration really does need to be appreciated as a part 2. In fact, the whole Joseph project is best enjoyed as a whole singular entity, as the amount of shared DNA across both albums really does allow each of them to feed into each other. The callbacks in Part 2 really do make the individual moments in Part 1 stronger and vice versa. This is a classic example of one record making the other one stronger, and the sum of the whole unit being so much stronger than them standing in isolation. But I suppose that's another slight bugbear I have with the restoration. It's just how much it relies on the knowledge and understanding of Part 1 in order to get the most out of it. The return of certain riffs, certain vocal melodies and lyrical runs in this album simply won't have the same impact unless you've dedicated a decent chunk of your time to getting your head around The Dreamer. For me, personally, it's not an issue. I listened to The Dreamer knowing that this album was coming out, so I've always kind of approached that as such. The first course, the tease before the big finale, and the grandiosity of the restoration is clear as day to anyone listening to it. When you hit the track Freedom Road, right up to the finale of Dawning of a New Day, God Uses Everything for Good, you can feel the escalation of it all, as Neal expertly builds and layers and layers. I honestly get a particular vibe of some of his best work from Sola Scriptura on the moments leading up to the climax of this album. The brothers Repent Joseph Revealed is a particular late highlight of the album and definitely showcases the considerable instrumental chops of everyone involved. Speaking of chops, I just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge just how fantastic Morse still sounds. Dude Bro is like 63 years old and still sounds every bit as fantastic as he did on The Light. His vocals are amongst the most comforting and reassuring in the business, managing to be both technically accomplished, instantly recognisable, and about as American as apple pie, all in one bourbon-smooth serving. Not to mention the fact that he's rocking the keyboards and guitars, as well as contributing to drums and percussion on this album. He is a powerhouse of a musician, and when you combine this with how prolific he's been of late, it's clear as day to anyone listening that Morse lives and breathes his faith through his music, and frankly it is beautiful to behold. Now, I'm not a Christian man myself, but the passion and love that Neal puts into his music from his faith is extremely inspiring, and it is always a wonderful thing to see him perform. Now, I very nearly bought tickets for the upcoming London Morse Fest, but I'm still unfortunately having to be fiscally responsible with an incoming imminent house move. Woo! So, what else can I say about Neal Morse's The Restoration Joseph Part 2? I think this is honestly one of the easiest recommendations I could possibly give to a fan of Neal Morse's. I mean, sure, if you didn't like The Dreamer, you won't like this. It definitely sings from the same hymn sheet, but there's a step up in the theatricality and musicianship, especially in the latter part of the album, and I honestly find that super appealing. It's bombastic, unafraid, full of passion and energy, and despite the risk of potential burnout from oversaturation of his sound, the restoration manages to simultaneously explore the parts of Morse's catalogue that he's at his strongest with, while blending them with new lessons that he's picked up since Jesus Christ the Exorcist and The Dreamer. It's not a perfect album by any stretch of the imagination, perhaps taking a little while to wind up to the good stuff, maybe a smidge overlong, and perhaps overly dependent on familiarity with its predecessor, but this is still a record I would heartily recommend picking up in digital format, but definitely grab a physical copy if you're already on board the Joseph train. This is all, of course, my opinion, guys, as you know, so if you have listened to Joseph Part 2, please tell me what you thought of the record in the comments down below. If you did like this video, please do share it around with anyone else you think would possibly enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing to the channel for more content. I will be leaving my link tree down below where you'll find all the various places to find me on social media, so please do hit me up. Until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures extremely odd.